my fellow panelists and participants in this conference. It was a delight to listen to Mr. Rajendran, and I'm looking forward to hearing Mr. Vivek Kulkarni. And Mr. Rajendran spoke about his advantage of being youthful. I was just wondering what should I do stuck in the middle of youth and experience. And I thought somehow I'll muddle through and try and look at the possible advantages I can reap in the process. My focus is very specifically going to be on what does higher education need to look at in terms of the demographic dividend and in terms of converting the demographics into a dividend rather than a disaster. So I'm going to look at higher education today in the global context and how, in the light of demographics, we may have to redefine priorities, we may have to redetermine our strategies and standards, and we need to develop newer ways in which we look at issues to be able to ready to reap the benefits of the demographic dividend. 2 points to start with. I think when we talk of higher education today and its preparedness for tomorrow, I think there are two issues we need to keep in mind. The supply side with regard to higher education and the demand side with regard to higher education. And when I'm talking of the supply side, I'm referring to government, its political leadership, its policy-making apparatus, its educational administrators, what is the preparedness on their part, and on the other hand, also educational institutions, both public and private. When I look at the demand side, we are looking at the expectations of the key stakeholder here with regard to higher education, who is the youth. And I'm going to dwell a little on that because we have an advantage of an entire report on that. 7 years ago, we did the first ever youth survey in Karnataka, the first survey done by any state of India, where we looked at the aims, aspirations, expectations of youth in the state. And I'm going to dwell into that because a lot was said by young people about what they wanted the nature of education to be. And that got converted later into the state youth policy. So that would be the demand side, which I will touch on as I proceed. Now, to provide the context for the preparedness of the state, when we look at the supply side and looked at the state as a critical player in higher education, in the preparedness of the state, there are 4 very quick points that I'd like to highlight and emphasize. The first one, the whole debate we have been having since yesterday here on harnessing the benefits of the demographic dividend. 3-4 quick points which I think Mr. Rajendran also touched about and we have been discussing since yesterday. The first is, I think, the fact that by 2030, if you look at the global population in the employable age, if you look at the global population which is going to be in the employable age in 2030, studies show 1 out of every 4 of them would be from this country. Now, if that is the case, that in 14 years from now, 1 out of every 4 in the employable age in the world is from this country, how is our system of higher education preparing them to take that benefit at that point of time? I think here we must keep in mind the dynamics of scale. The dynamics of scale we are talking about here. Of course, we have had several figures, even Mr. Rajendran quoted here about the gross enrollment ratio that you have in higher education. Globally, people say the latest statistic shows it's around 30%. In countries like Japan, it's as high as 55%. In the United States, 45%. In UK, 45%. In USA, 34%. China, 28%. There are a lot of debates on how much it is in India. Some people quote 2009, 2010, 2011. The 2015 figures for this is, in India, 21.6%, which means we are still much behind. The government plan is by 2020, it should be 30%, closer to the global average. But you know what that means in terms of higher education? If we have to move to 20%, this means creating, just imagine the dynamics of scale. This means creating 40 million positions in higher education institutions. Just look at the enormity of the task we are referring to. 40 million places in higher education institutions if we are to reach that target that we are talking about with regard to 2020. The second question on the forging of partnerships, I think if we are looking at higher education's preparedness, there are 3 points I'd like to emphasize in forging partnerships. Number one, partnerships between government and private. Studies are showing that in higher education, over time, the private sector is going to account for more than 60% of the enrollment that's going to happen. If that is the case, what is the nature of the government-private partnership we should have? Mr. Rajendran is here, he spoke about it. I'm sure Kulkarni ji will also talk about it. Are we looking at a dynamic academy-industry interaction? We have these platforms where Rajendran sir has come, he has told us, please bear in mind the statistics he gave us about how much was the percentage of employable products of higher education. Now, are we in the process of creating these platforms for interaction? We have a lot of researchers here. How much of our research is in academia linked to what is happening in the industry? We have taken the initiative, I know we should be doing much more. How much of our curriculum design and our curriculum preparation has inputs from the industry? Because that's the point he was making. That we may be doing a great job in terms of teaching, and I'd like to pat my back for that. We may be doing a great job in terms of teaching, but what the industry wants us to do, our product may be great, but our product may not be fitted to what is required in the industry. And the third, national and international collaborations. You may say that in this international conference, I must talk about international collaborations. Our tragedy is we don't talk about national collaborations. We want to tie up with every conceivable university outside India. But we don't want to harness the potential available in Bangalore. We don't want to look at what sister institutions across us are doing, and we actually could benefit from that tie-up. So for me, reaping the dividend, the demographic dividend involves actually collaboration, I'm not for a moment underestimating or undervaluing the importance of international collaboration. It's critical. But I think if we are to truly get the benefit of the demographics, what we need is collaboration within the country, getting institutions with similar skill sets to come together and be able to help the process, help the students, help the learners in the process. The third point there, the learner centricity of the whole approach. Those of you who have gone through the Karnataka youth policy, one very important principle of that youth policy was a learner first, learner always approach to higher education. Keeping the learner as the center of the entire process. I think if that were to be something which were not to happen, the question would then be, and I'm sure a lot of you who are students today and who were students not very long ago have often asked ourselves this question when we sat in a classroom. When we sat in a classroom and heard a great lecture maybe, have we not asked ourselves a question, did I actually come here for this? Did I actually come to the system for this? This whole question of what the learner requires as part of the process. And the last point here on this slide, a global outlook, yes, but a global outlook rooted in local ground reality, which often we don't take into account. Let me take an example for this. Higher education. Today, 80% of higher education is in undergraduate education. 80% of those, 8 out of 10 who are enrolled in higher education today are in undergraduate. And what is their profile of that 80%? And I think it's important to understand this if we are looking at skilling them for the future. 1/3 of them, 34%, 1/3 of that 80% is pursuing undergraduate courses in liberal arts. They are pursuing in liberal arts. Another 15%, 1/6, is pursuing degrees in commerce and management. 2 out of 10, 19% are pursuing in engineering, and the balance in pure science. My question is, are we focusing, doing justice, looking at the profile of our current undergraduate education? Because this is what we are going to talk about providing employability to with regard to the future. I am a very, very strong advocate of education through a distance mode beyond the formal classroom. But today, 13% of those enrolled in higher education are through distance mode. And of that 13%, 40% of them are women. Where we can understand the compulsions of why higher education through distance mode was critical to them. Now, my question is, if we have to reap the demographic dividend, this particular reality which I am talking about is something that needs to be budgeted in. I, without a shadow of doubt, will endorse the comment which Mr. Rajendran made, which I am sure Mr. Kulkarni will make next. Connect to IT. Connect to information technology. Can I add a line after that? Reconnect to human technology. Because we must connect to IT. Yes, no shadow of doubt. We must connect to information technology. But that connection to information technology must also involve a reconnecting to human technology, because at the end of the day, you are talking of people. Let me come to the next set of issues I thought we need to emphasize in higher education, the demand side. What is the aspirations of young people today? And this is not, though of course I would consider myself as young and compete with Rajendran in defining ourselves as young. I'm basing this on, and so Subramanian sir is laughing there and saying, I qualify more than you, I agree with you. The question is, this is based on the youth survey and the youth report. What young people, and in India we define young people as those between 15 and 34, what did they say with regard to their aspirations for the future? Because I think this importantly needs to be budgeted into any analysis of changes in higher education. A few quick points of what young people said about what they expected. Aspirations, again, a huge number of the young people said higher education was an aspiration. But I want to ask an uncomfortable question. Was aspiration for higher education a means to postpone your unemployment? Did I pursue higher education because I saw that as the only way I could keep myself busy, because otherwise I would not get a job? So should not the higher education process not just be a mechanical necessity which young people feel that they must have as a degree after their names? But what about that skill set that Rajendran sir talked about? How to make, did you say 21% or 12%? That 21%, how do we convert the balance 79% that he talked about? Who, through the education system, what do they take forward? The second point, which I'm sure Kulkarni sir will not find very surprising, he's one of those rare people who decided to take off it. Even today, and you all may be honorable exceptions, even today across the board, when young people were asked, what type of employment are you looking for? Government jobs. Government jobs was the preference. If I remember right, 6 out of 10 youth said, given a choice, we want a government job. Now, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with that, but what I'm saying is, how does a society, through different stakeholders, part of this may be parents. Many young people have told me, I want a government job because my parents said that I must get a government job. I must get a government job because societal pressures require me to get a government job. So, does the higher education system plan today allow for the young people to be able to think differently on this issue? Again, limiting myself to Karnataka. Most people said, given a choice, I want to work in Karnataka itself. I want to go out. Now, how does one, through the education system, actually change the way people look at these issues? It's very interesting. What was the biggest anxiety that young people talked about? One was, of course, career. What will be the job I get after I complete my studies? And this is important for all of us educators, more than half of the youth said, one of the most stressful things in my youth has been studying. Going through education has been one of the biggest stresses I face. So in terms of policy imperatives, can we ask the question as to how can this higher education system we are talking about, if we are talking about reaping a demographic dividend, how can that system be made less stressful for people? In terms of policy imperatives, I'm going to just focus on 2-3 issues here. I've said there, now can higher education sensitize young people to the world of opportunities that is available to them? We at Jain may be doing that. Private systems may be doing that. But we account for a very small chunk of those going through higher education. Now, how does that sensitivity spread across? Are we opening up in higher education 2 things? Life skills, training skills, and active social engagement skills. Because I would argue both these are critical for young people to reap the demographic dividend. The whole question of skilling young people, not only in terms of their technical knowledge and capacities, but their skills for life, their skills for living. Which is exactly, I think, the point which Rajendran ji was making as part of his presentation. And I'll make one more, I'll make just one more point here on that. Any capacity to empower young people must keep in mind what I would call the credo of relevance. By credo of relevance, I mean aspirations, societal needs, societal expectations, and most importantly, what works at the ground level. Let me come to the final part of what I want to say, to try and tie up all the issues I have raised together. I think higher education is very much an important site at which we will have to look at ways and means by which the demographics we are talking about transforms itself into a dividend rather than into a disaster. And 2 points which I mentioned earlier, I think are important. The issue of scale and the issue of locale. Can we keep in mind that when we are trying to seek the benefit of the demographics, the scale? I just would like to throw back one statistics I used. 40 million positions in higher education across the country in a 4-year period. Which would mean, if you are starting today, 10 million positions of learning in higher education institutions. And linked to scale is what I said, locale. What I refer to as the percentages within undergraduate education, who is in what stream. And are we focusing on those set streams, or, and let me be blunt, are we focusing on those streams which are seen as fashionable? Where is the bulk which is there in the higher education system, and are we doing enough to be able to deal with that bulk? And I think in higher education, when you look at priorities, there are three issues here. Creating the right academic architecture. This whole new UGC initiative, I think, is very critical. It depends on how we take it forward. This whole choice-based credit systems, where a science student needs to take non-science courses, a commerce and management student needs to take non-commerce courses, an arts student needs to take non-arts courses. When I said this to a student recently, she said, let me at least do my courses properly. Why are you pushing me to other courses now? And then slowly, the logic of that got to be realized. Why are we asking you to move into courses which are not of your strict domain? Because at the end of the day, higher education is not about just the skill set you acquire, it is about the larger life training that you're able to get. Setting the right pace. Sometimes in our excitement to be able to do things, are we expecting a pace from the system which is A, illogical, and B, something divorced from reality? That, I think, is again something that we need to work on. The credo of relevance I've already talked about. And finally, in terms of output, Vivek Kulkarni ji was in government, now he has moved out of government. I'm sure he is also facing this challenge. The last one I'm talking about. How do you make sure the regulatory framework does not become the be-all and end-all of what you have to do? Today, a huge challenge in university or higher education today is you focus on meeting regulatory framework requirements. What all else you have achieved is not important. Have you met regulatory framework requirements? And therefore, rather than focusing on having people who have skills ready for tomorrow, ready for day after tomorrow, ready for the day after that, you are more focusing on the regulatory agencies should be satisfied with what I'm doing. So is there not today a need for, and this is where I believe the stakeholder on the supply side becomes important. Is it not important that the regulatory framework is, now I must make this point, I'm not talking about regulatory framework being a free-for-all. When you set the minimal standards, can you give that space for education today to take things forward, meeting those standards that you talk about? Rather than regulatory framework becoming a oppression on the system, can it be an enabler in the system for change to happen? And finally, any preventing of the demographics becoming a disaster would require us to take the perspectives of young people into account. Can higher education, should not higher education strategize about helping young people who are going through that education take ownership for the process? And that would happen if higher education processes fulfill what the Karnataka Youth Policy says, which I hope is something going to be replicated across other states. A learner first, learner always approach. At the end of the day, the whole question of whether the aspirations, expectations, hopes, goals of the learner are somewhere budgeted into the process. And when that's done, I'm reasonably confident that the higher education system would provide to the learner those inputs, not which the higher education system demands, but what the youth believes I want also as part of that system. That, I think, would be the process where the disaster dimension of demographics would be avoided and the dividend dimension of the demographics would be taken into account. Because at the end of the day, the dividend, as a good commerce professor would say, the dividend goes to the shareholder. And here a critical shareholder we have is the young people who are going through education. Do they get that dividend? Does the education system provide that opportunity for the dividend? I think the next 15 years, if higher education, I go back to the 3 words I used in the beginning: priorities, strategies, and plan. If that's in place in higher education, I'm sure the dividend would be something which is possible to demand, and the disaster is something we would not need to dream of at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep Shastri. I think that was a super continuation. If I recall, Mr. Rajendran spoke about whether it should be hiring and training, or it should be training and hiring. Obviously, his preference would be training and hiring, which is a training which is done by the educational institution. And Dr. Sandeep Shastri, in fact, said, how do we make that happen? And what are some of the challenges and obstacles to it? I now call upon Mr. Vivek Kulkarni to please address the audience on the third part of this plenary session. I also welcome C.V. Ramkumar, who is here right in front, who will be talking to us about our next year's conference theme for a brief moment soon after all the speakers have spoken. Thank you.